I never imagined that the HOA Karen, who showed up on my porch demanding I sell my home, was the mastermind behind the darkest chapter of my life. Under her million-dollar pool, federal agents uncovered hidden bodies, people who had dared to oppose her empire. For 2 years, my own son had been secretly feeding her information about my daily life, helping her tighten her grip on our neighborhood. What started as a petty HOA dispute exploded into a federal investigation that exposed a secret prison, $50 million in stolen funds, and a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of power. My name is Benjamin Carter, but everyone calls me Ben. I'm 60 years old, and 3 years ago I lost my wife Linda. Since then, I've been living alone in a wooden cabin that my great-grandfather built in 1914 in Maple Valley, Colorado. The house is simple. Old cedar boards, a porch with carved railings, and windows that have seen over a century of Colorado weather. Linda and I used to sit on this porch every morning, drinking coffee and talking about our plans. 3 years ago, Linda died. The doctor said it was cancer, but now I know what really happened, and it makes me angry every time I think about it. 6 months ago, the Sterling family bought the lot next door and built a huge mansion with an $800,000 swimming pool. The pool had artificial waterfalls and LED lights that changed colors constantly. Victoria Sterling became the president of our HOA and decided to upgrade the neighborhood to what she called elite standards. I later learned she used the HOA to cover up much worse activities. Victoria was a 35-year-old woman who wore sequined tops and had extremely long fake nails that clicked on everything. She wore oversized sunglasses and drove a red Maserati. She treated most people like they were stupid. That Sunday morning, she didn't knock. She just walked up my porch steps and started giving me orders. She told me that my old cabin had to go because it was ruining the look of their elite community and hurting property values. I replied politely that the cabin had been in my family for over a century and met all county building codes. She laughed in a way that sounded mean and said she would pay me 3 times what the house was worth if I would move somewhere more suitable for someone like me. When I said no, her attitude changed completely. She warned me that I was going to find out how uncomfortable she could make my life, explaining that this community was for people who understood progress, not people who wanted to live in the past. I watched her drive away and knew my quiet life was about to become much more complicated. Victoria wasted no time launching a systematic harassment campaign designed to drive me out through sheer exhaustion. She began hosting pool parties that lasted until 2 a.m., with music blasting from speakers that seemed designed for football stadiums rather than backyard entertainment. The bass would shake my cabin walls and rattle the windows that my great-grandfather had installed over a century ago. She hired landscaping crews to mow their lawn with gas-powered equipment at exactly 6 a.m. every Saturday and Sunday, positioning them right outside my bedroom window. When the mowing finished, they would switch to leaf blowers, then hedge trimmers, creating hours of mechanical noise that made sleep impossible. These weren't random maintenance visits. They happened with military precision every weekend without fail. But the worst part was how she weaponized the HOA itself against me. Victoria filed formal complaints to the HOA board about toxic smoke from my wood-burning fireplace, despite the fact that I had been using it safely for decades and it met all local regulations. She sent HOA inspectors to my property weekly, searching for any possible code violations they could find. They measured my grass height, checked the paint color on my shutters, and documented every minor imperfection. Victoria used the HOA as her personal enforcement army against anyone she considered unwanted in the neighborhood. She created new rules almost weekly: no personal items visible in front yards, all house paint colors subject to board approval, pets required to be registered with specific veterinarians she selected. Every rule seemed designed to target someone specific who had crossed her. The harassment began affecting my daily routine in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself lying awake at night, waiting for the next wave of noise to begin. My blood pressure rose from the constant stress, and I started avoiding the porch that had been my sanctuary since Linda's passing. After weeks of escalating problems, I decided to call attorney James Patterson. He had helped me handle Linda's estate 3 years earlier, and I trusted his judgment. Patterson was a quiet man in his 50s who listened carefully before offering advice. I drove to his office in downtown Maple Valley, a cluttered space filled with case files and law books that had seen better days. When I explained the situation with Victoria and the HOA harassment, Patterson's expression grew serious as he reviewed the documents I had brought. He told me there was something important I needed to know about the Sterling family, and he warned me that I wouldn't like what he was about to reveal. Patterson explained that this wasn't his first encounter with their activities, and the situation was more complicated than a simple neighbor dispute. He opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents, spreading them across his desk with the careful movements of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. Patterson said he had been quietly gathering information about the Sterling family's business practices for several years. He revealed that Victoria's harassment campaign against me wasn't random or personal. It was part of a larger pattern that had affected multiple families throughout the county. According to his research, the Sterlings had systematically targeted homeowners in valuable locations, using HOA authority to create impossible living conditions until people sold their properties at below-market prices. Patterson explained that the Sterling family had connections throughout local government that allowed them to operate with impunity. HOA board members, county inspectors, and even some judges had financial relationships with Sterling business interests. The whole system was designed to funnel money and property to their organization while maintaining a facade of legitimate community management. Most disturbing was what Patterson told me about what happened to Linda. He had been investigating industrial chemical dumping in our area and discovered that several families near illegal disposal sites had experienced unusual illnesses. Linda's symptoms matched those of other people who had been exposed to the same toxic substances. He suggested that Linda's passing might not have been the natural tragedy I believed it was, but rather the result of environmental poisoning that someone had worked very hard to cover up. The timing of the Sterling family's arrival in our neighborhood, combined with their immediate focus on acquiring my property, wasn't coincidental. Patterson warned me that if his suspicions were correct, I was dealing with people who had already proven they would go to extreme lengths to get what they wanted. He advised me to be very careful about my next steps, because the Sterling family had resources and connections that could make my life much more difficult than simple HOA harassment. Patterson opened a thick folder with deliberate care, his weathered hands moving slowly as if he was about to reveal something that had been weighing on him for years. He looked at me directly and explained that he wasn't simply a small-town attorney handling wills and property disputes. Before opening his private practice, he had spent 15 years working for the FBI, specializing in white-collar crime and organized criminal enterprises. I felt my jaw drop as he continued, explaining that for the past 20 years, he had been secretly investigating the Sterling family's activities. This wasn't a recent interest sparked by my current problems. It was a long-term operation that had consumed much of his professional life. He told me they were running one of the most sophisticated money laundering schemes he had ever encountered, using real estate transactions to clean millions of dollars in illegal profits. The operation involved dozens of shell companies, fake property assessments, and a network of corrupt officials who helped facilitate their transactions. What made his investigation particularly urgent, Patterson explained, was the pattern of what happened to people who got too close to exposing their activities. Over the past 30 years, 3 different witnesses who had been prepared to testify against the Sterling family had mysteriously disappeared from the picture. All of these cases had been officially classified as accidents, car crashes, hiking mishaps, apparent medical emergencies. But the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. I felt my throat constrict as the implications of what he was telling me became clear. I managed to whisper Linda's name, unable to form a complete sentence as the terrible possibility began to take shape in my mind. Patterson nodded grimly and explained that he had been investigating what happened to Linda for over 2 years. Her symptoms during her final illness matched those of other people who had been exposed to industrial chemicals that the Sterling family had been illegally burying throughout the county for decades. The cancer diagnosis had been accurate, but the underlying cause was environmental poisoning, not natural disease. He opened another file and showed me medical records from other families who had lived near Sterling properties. The pattern was undeniable: unusually high rates of aggressive cancers in people who had been exposed to contaminated groundwater. The Sterling family had been systematically poisoning the environment to hide their illegal waste disposal, and Linda had been one of the victims. Patterson explained that he had been trying to build a federal case against the Sterling family for years, but they had connections throughout local law enforcement that made investigation difficult. Witnesses had been intimidated into silence. Evidence had mysteriously disappeared from police storage, and officials who asked too many questions found themselves transferred to different departments. The reason Victoria was so determined to acquire my property, Patterson revealed, wasn't just about neighborhood aesthetics or property values. My land sat directly above one of their major illegal disposal sites, and they needed to control it to prevent anyone from discovering what was buried there. He told me that if I decided to fight back against their harassment campaign, I needed to understand that I would be taking on a criminal organization with resources and connections far beyond what most people could imagine. But he also assured me that I wouldn't be fighting alone. He had been waiting for the right moment to move against them, and my situation might provide the opening he needed. Patterson warned me that the Sterling family had proven they would go to extreme lengths to protect their operation. They had eliminated obstacles before, and they wouldn't hesitate to escalate their harassment if they felt threatened. But he also believed that with the right evidence and federal support, we could finally bring their criminal enterprise to an end. The revelation that my wife's passing had been the result of deliberate environmental poisoning filled me with a rage I hadn't felt since her diagnosis 3 years earlier. But now that anger had a target and a purpose, stopping the people responsible from hurting anyone else the way they had hurt Linda and our family. That night, I couldn't sleep. Patterson's words kept echoing in my mind, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, thinking about Linda's final weeks and all the questions I had never asked. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to rest and walked to the garage where I had stored most of Linda's belongings after she passed. I had been avoiding this space for 3 years, unable to face the boxes of books, craft supplies, and personal items that still carried her scent of lavender soap and the vanilla candles she loved. The garage felt cold and dusty, filled with shadows and memories I wasn't ready to confront. Among the carefully labeled boxes, Linda had always been organized about everything, I found a small metal jewelry box that she had kept on her dresser for as long as I could remember. She had always kept it locked, and I had respected her privacy, assuming it contained sentimental items from her childhood or perhaps letters from old friends. My hands shook as I searched through her things until I found the tiny key she had hidden in her sewing kit. The lock turned easily, and inside, beneath some old photographs and a few pieces of jewelry her grandmother had given her, I found an envelope with my name written in her careful handwriting. The letter was dated just 2 months before she became ill, and as I read her words, I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Linda explained that if I was reading this message, something serious had happened to her, and she needed me to know about discoveries she had made. Linda had written about witnessing the Sterling family dumping chemical waste into the stream behind our house 2 years ago. What seemed like a one-time event turned out to be routine, happening at night with precision. She secretly documented everything, photographing from our bedroom window, recording conversations, and collecting water samples. Over months, she built a solid case with photos, lab results, and audio recordings. She hid all the evidence in a waterproof box under a loose floorboard in our bedroom, beneath her parents' heavy oak dresser. She left detailed instructions and urged me to use it to stop the Sterlings and protect other families. She had feared her exposure might be fatal and prepared for that possibility. I followed her directions and found the container. Inside were damning photos, test results, and recordings. Linda had conducted a meticulous investigation, leaving undeniable proof of the Sterlings' environmental crimes. I realized why they wanted my land. It offered a direct view of their dumping site. Her sacrifice gave me the tools to continue her fight. The next morning, still reeling from the discovery, a woman knocked on my door. She introduced herself as Rachel Morgan, an investigative journalist from the Denver Post. Her determination reminded me of Linda. Over coffee, she explained that what I'd faced was part of a larger scheme. For 10 years, the Sterling family had used HOAs as fronts to drive out families and launder money. They'd gain HOA control, harass owners into selling, buy properties cheaply through shell companies, and inflate values through fraudulent assessments. Then they sold them again to launder funds. Rachel showed me documents proving systematic fraud across counties, property records, HOA minutes, and financials. Her tone shifted when she shared her personal connection. 20 years ago, her mother had uncovered financial irregularities linked to the Sterlings. Before she could report them, she died in a suspicious car crash. Rachel believed the Sterlings were behind it, fueling her mission ever since. Rachel told me that her mother, Sarah Morgan, had been an accountant working for a mid-sized firm that handled financial services for various Sterling business interests. Her mother had been meticulous about her work and had gradually noticed irregularities in the accounts she was managing. Unexplained transfers, duplicate billing, and payment patterns that didn't match the services supposedly being provided. As her mother investigated further, she discovered evidence of systematic financial fraud involving multiple companies and millions of dollars in suspicious transactions. Being a responsible professional, she had compiled detailed documentation of the violations and had decided to report her findings to the appropriate authorities. Rachel explained that her mother had scheduled a meeting with FBI financial crimes investigators to turn over her evidence and provide testimony about what she had discovered. The meeting was planned for a Tuesday morning, and her mother had spent the previous weekend organizing her documentation and preparing her statement. But on Monday night, something terrible happened. Rachel's voice grew quiet as she described how her mother's car had left the road while she was driving home from work, resulting in a crash that appeared to be a tragic accident. The official investigation concluded that her mother had likely fallen asleep at the wheel or experienced some kind of medical emergency. However, Rachel revealed that a mechanic who had examined the wreckage privately told her family that the brake system had been tampered with in a way that would cause failure at high speed. The mechanic had been afraid to go to the police with his findings, fearing retaliation, but he had shared his concerns with Rachel's father before disappearing from the area entirely. Rachel explained that this personal tragedy had motivated her to become an investigative journalist and had led her to spend years tracking the Sterling family's activities. She had been building a comprehensive case against them, documenting their crimes across multiple jurisdictions, and gathering evidence that could finally bring their operation to an end. She told me that my situation represented a unique opportunity because Linda's evidence, combined with my willingness to fight back, could provide the breakthrough she had been working toward for decades. Unlike previous victims who had been isolated and intimidated into silence, I had both documentation of their crimes and access to legal support through Patterson's FBI connections. Rachel explained that she had been coordinating with federal investigators who were also interested in the Sterling case, and she believed that together we could finally expose their criminal enterprise and ensure that they faced justice for all the families they had hurt over the years. As we talked, I realized that Linda's brave investigation had connected me to a network of people who shared the same goal, stopping the Sterling family before they could harm anyone else. My quiet mountain cabin had become the center of a much larger battle for justice that had been building for decades. 2 days later, while I was still trying to process everything Rachel had told me about the Sterling family's extensive criminal network, my phone rang with a call that would shatter what remained of my trust in the people closest to me. The caller ID showed my son David's number from Seattle, which surprised me because we typically only spoke once or twice a month, usually on weekends when he had more free time. David worked for a large consulting firm and lived a busy life that didn't often include lengthy conversations with his aging father. When I answered, David's voice carried a tone of concern that seemed genuine at first, but something about it felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced what he was going to say before making the call. He told me he had heard through some unspecified channels that I was having serious problems with neighbors and suggested that perhaps it was time for me to consider relocating to somewhere more suitable for someone in my situation. David mentioned that he had been thinking about our family's future and believed that staying in the old cabin might not be the best choice for my health and well-being. He reminded me that Linda wouldn't have wanted me to suffer or struggle unnecessarily, and he offered to help me find a nice apartment or retirement community where I could have assistance with daily activities. What struck me as odd was how quickly he had learned about my situation with the Sterling family, since I hadn't mentioned anything to him about the HOA problems or the harassment campaign Victoria had been conducting. David seemed to know specific details about my conflicts with the neighbors that I was certain I hadn't shared with anyone outside of Patterson and Rachel. The conversation continued with David pressing the issue more urgently than I would have expected, suggesting that I was being stubborn about clinging to a property that was clearly causing me stress and difficulty. He even offered to handle the logistics of selling the cabin and moving my belongings, which seemed unusually generous for someone who lived across the country and rarely visited. After we ended the call, I sat in my kitchen feeling deeply unsettled by something I couldn't quite identify. David's concern seemed genuine, but the timing and specificity of his knowledge about my situation raised questions that made me increasingly uncomfortable as the evening wore on. The next morning, I called Patterson and explained my conversation with David, describing the details that had seemed strange and asking if there might be a way to investigate whether my son had any connection to the Sterling family or their associates. Patterson listened carefully to my concerns and agreed that the timing was suspicious enough to warrant a closer look. Patterson said he had contacts who could discreetly investigate financial ties and offered to check David's banking and business records. Though I felt guilty, the situation was too serious to ignore. 3 days later, Patterson called me in with shocking results. David had been receiving monthly payments from a Denver-based firm, Mountain Vista Consulting. On the surface, it looked legitimate, but Patterson's deeper probe revealed it was a shell company linked to the Sterling family. The payments had started 2 years ago, shortly after I mentioned cabin renovations to David. Though not huge, $2,000 to $3,000 a month, they were consistent and unaccompanied by any evidence of real work. No invoices, reports, or correspondence that would justify the money. Worse, each deposit aligned with calls or visits between us, suggesting David was being paid to report on my life, my health, finances, and future plans. Patterson even uncovered emails between David and Sterling contacts. They were vague, but clearly showed him providing updates on my daily habits and condition. One particularly painful email showed David reporting to his Sterling contact that I had been increasingly isolated and depressed since Linda's passing, and that I might be vulnerable to pressure if someone made the right kind of offer for the HOA property. Another message described my daily habits in detail, including when I typically left the house and whether I had any regular visitors. The discovery that my own son had been systematically betraying my privacy and trust for financial gain felt like a physical blow that left me struggling to breathe. David hadn't just taken money from the people who had harmed Linda. He had actively helped them target me by providing inside information about my vulnerabilities and routines. Patterson tried to offer some comfort by suggesting that David might not have fully understood what he was getting involved in, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The communications showed that David had been aware he was providing information to people who intended to pressure me into selling the family property, and he had continued taking their money even as their harassment campaign escalated. I realized that every conversation I had with my son over the past 2 years had potentially been mined for information that could be used against me. My discussions about Linda's passing, my health concerns, my financial worries, and my attachment to the family cabin had all been reported back to people who were actively working to destroy my life. The betrayal cut deeper than anything the Sterling family had done to me directly, because it came from someone I had trusted completely and loved unconditionally. David had sold out his own father for what amounted to pocket change compared to the Sterling family's vast criminal enterprise. Based on Linda's comprehensive evidence, Patterson was able to work with his federal contacts to obtain a search warrant for the Sterling property. The process took several weeks of careful legal preparation, as the warrant needed to be broad enough to allow excavation around the pool area while being specific enough to satisfy judicial review. Patterson explained that federal agents had been building their own case against the Sterling family for months, and Linda's documentation provided the missing pieces they needed to justify such an extensive search operation. The warrant authorized not only excavation but also examination of financial records, electronic devices, and any other evidence related to environmental crimes and money laundering. On a cold October morning, I watched from my kitchen window as a convoy of vehicles began arriving at the Sterling property. EPA trucks with specialized equipment, federal agents in unmarked cars, and a team of forensic archaeologists who had been specially trained to handle potential crime scene excavations. The operation looked more like a military deployment than a typical law enforcement search. Rachel arrived at my house early that morning, explaining that she had been granted permission to observe the search as part of her ongoing journalistic investigation. We stood together on my porch, drinking coffee and watching as workers in protective suits began setting up their equipment around Victoria's million-dollar pool. The first phase of the operation involved draining the pool completely and removing all the decorative features, the artificial waterfalls, LED lighting systems, and expensive tile work that had been Victoria's pride and joy. I felt a grim satisfaction watching her ostentatious display of wealth being systematically dismantled by federal investigators. Patterson joined us around noon, explaining that the initial ground-penetrating radar scans had revealed anomalies beneath the pool foundation that suggested the presence of man-made structures. The readings indicated hollow spaces and possibly constructed chambers that definitely shouldn't have existed under a residential swimming pool. As the excavation continued into the afternoon, the workers began uncovering what appeared to be reinforced concrete structures buried several feet below the pool's foundation. The construction was sophisticated, with waterproof ceiling and ventilation systems that indicated serious planning and significant financial investment. The breakthrough came when excavators uncovered a large underground chamber. EPA agents in protective gear entered with cameras and monitors. An hour later, the lead investigator returned, grim-faced, and called in more federal and forensic teams. This had escalated far beyond environmental violations. The underground complex was vast. The first chamber held a climate-controlled storage area with millions in cash, evidence of long-term money laundering. The second chamber contained stolen artwork, jewelry, and rare collectibles tied to unsolved thefts across multiple states. But it was the third chamber that shifted the investigation. Forensic anthropologists emerged with somber expressions, confirming they had found something far worse. Rachel clutched my arm as we watched investigators meticulously document the scene. This chamber held proof that people had been imprisoned and died down there. 3 sets of skeletal remains were found, each carefully recorded for lab analysis. One set included items Rachel's mother had worn when she vanished 2 decades earlier. Her silver anniversary bracelet confirmed the identity, bringing painful closure to Rachel's family. Federal agents marked evidence throughout the chambers. Beneath a luxury pool, the Sterling family had hidden a criminal empire that included illegal imprisonment and likely murder. The investigation continued for 3 more days as specialized teams documented every aspect of the underground complex. The evidence they gathered would eventually support charges ranging from money laundering and art theft to kidnapping and multiple counts of eliminating witnesses who had posed threats to the Sterling operation. As I watched the Sterling mansion being surrounded by federal agents and crime scene tape, I realized that Linda's brave investigation had uncovered something far more sinister than environmental crimes. Her evidence had exposed a criminal organization that had been terrorizing our community for decades, and her sacrifice had finally brought justice for all their victims. As excavations continued, Victoria tried to use her connections. It turned out the judge who had previously issued warrants against me was her own brother, David Sterling. The local sheriff, fire chief, all were receiving bribes from the family. The entire local government was bought. But federal agents were outside their influence. When it became clear the game was over, Victoria tried to destroy evidence. At night, she and a group of mercenaries attempted to blow up the underground complex, but federal agents were waiting. In the underground complex, they found documents proving that over 30 years, the family had stolen over $50 million through fake HOA fees and eliminated at least 7 witnesses. Victoria received life imprisonment for running a criminal organization and causing people's deaths. Her brother Judge got 20 years for corruption. My son David was arrested as an accomplice and received probation in exchange for cooperation. Rachel and I became close friends during the investigation, and over time our friendship grew into something more. A year later, we married. On the site of the Sterling Mansion, we created a memorial park named for the victims of their crimes. Every morning I drink coffee on the porch, but now instead of noise, I hear children's laughter in the park and birds singing. Justice prevailed, and our land is free.